Hi, my name is Tim Carter, and this is IamKOINE.org, the apologetic and outreach ministry of Landmark Missionary Baptist Church in Jacksonville, Arkansas. The effort we're making is to simplify things, actually not simplify them, but to communicate the simplicity that is often or more often than not already there. For example, if we're asked a question about does regeneration precede faith, and that's quite a remarkable statement. Someone might say that. They might say regeneration, and they'll say it comes before faith. Well, if you're a student of KOINE, and it's a highly inflected language, you conjugate a verb, for example, just a standard, let's say, finite verb, but that would include tense, mood, voice, person, and number. So you'll have to talk about the kind of action in tense, the manner of its affirmation. In mood, is it asking a question? Is it making a statement? And voice, well, then you'll answer the question of what's the relationship of the subject to the action. And then, of course, person, first, second, third, and then plural or singular in number. So just in a simple conjugative expression or responsibility, you have certainly communicated more substantially than some abstract regeneration precedes faith, and or does faith follow it. So others say that faith precedes regeneration, but students of KOINE Greek would say, well, first of all, regeneration and faith, you're mentioning those are both nouns. You haven't really said, are we speaking of a finite verb like in John 20 verse 31, in order that you might deliberately cause yourselves to believe? That is a finite verb there, referring to the purpose of the attesting miracles of Christ and their contextualized narratives having been written and remain on record. That's perfect tense, for example. And it says, in order that you might deliberately cause yourself, it's a deliberative subjunctive. Subjunctive would fit in the category of mood. And we're now seeing it can be deliberative, helping us understand that the subject is in a deliberate mode of action. And it's causal, goes back to Genesis 15:6. Abram caused himself to believe. So if we're looking at the metaphysics of mankind, if we're looking at constructing this psychology of faith and the ability of a person, we find a finite verb here, and then in 1 John 5:1 we find that everyone who is deliberately causing him or herself to keep on believing, that present tense continuous action, is someone who has previously, prior to that, being that person who's always deliberately causing him or herself to be believing, has been fathered and continues and is always being fathered out from God. That's perfect tense, 1 John 5:1. So the KOINE really doesn't allow us to just make abstract assertions, because then they become absurdities. So R.C. Sproul, for example, when he said he was in a class in a seminary and the professor wrote on the board, regeneration precedes faith, he talked about how that was just so inverted from what he had been primed and, according to oral tradition, spoken and taught, if you will. Well, of course, he proceeded. Everything he saw after that point is, we were taught in the Missionary Baptist Seminary by Dr. Roger Copeland, that Calvinism, for example, which advocates regeneration precedes faith, becomes a lens. It's crafted, it's constructed, a mental construct. And as Dr. Copeland said, you don that lens that's been crafted or constructed, then everything you see fits this narrative. John MacArthur, for example, probably one of the most exhaustive expositors in the world, verse by verse, line by line, and yet, regardless of how exhaustive he is, it doesn't seem to find him any further along than the 5 points of Calvinism. For example, he'll take a text that says, God desires all men to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth. Well, he won't distinguish saved from regenerate, born again. which the Bible does. The Bible's very clear that Noah was saved through water, not fathered, born again through it. But that's neither here nor there. The Koine language just really isn't even familiar with such things that we seem to endlessly banter, and it even escalates to bloodshed and violence. We find even the verbal hostility expressed toward us here for just being willing to support the text. Faith means support. We don't use the text to support fallible religious constructs. We personally are faithful, supportive of the text, and thus we define, document, and then of course disclose these fallible elements. For example, in this statement, regeneration precedes faith, or faith precedes regeneration. Well, in one way it's both, in that this is a finite verb here. Let's just say that's a finite verb, and this is John 20:31. Well, this is a gerundive noun. It's a gerundive noun, a verbal substantive, a participle, which is a participative verbal idea here. It can be adverbial or adjectival. Well, here this is 1 John 5:1. So just that one assertion, when evaluated according to the logic, if you will, as Dr. Mark Thornton said in an article he once wrote, he said that it's not that we think like a Greek or the Greek language, we think like the rationale and all the indicators in the highly inflected language prompt us to think, and you really become scripted as we study it. So this heated battle of regeneration precedes faith, or faith precedes regeneration, is simply a large negative externality that comes from the small hinge on which this conflict turns. It's as simple as when someone talks about libertarian free will or compatibilistic free will, and no one notices that no one's defined it from the Bible, and yet in the biblical Hebrew, man has in several places is demonstrated to cause him or herself to believe, or cause faith. So it's just a matter of the inflections in the language. So it really it disappoints people who built, let's say, a large brand called Calvinism, or they've overinvested in it. Well, they can't really afford to back out. It's a threat to them. It seems to be imply incredulity, that somehow they don't have the credibility, that somehow I can't be wrong. Oh, we're always wrong. If you're a student who uses the process called historical holistic hermeneutics, one of the principles of it is we should first assume we're wrong before we approach the text, and then when we find ourselves deliberating and we're somewhat in a internal banter in our own minds, let's say, we become conflicted, we should back away and say, well, have we defined the term? If we have, is it a verb or a noun? If it's a verb, is it finite or is it a verbal? And what relationship does it have to the primary action, the finite verb? Here we have a perfect tense finite verb in relationship to this participle. These are just things that begin to help unravel or prevent this from going too far. Today, you can do research on the country Ireland if you want to, and see the Northern Ireland and the conflict that have gone on because of sectarianism over things between Catholic and unhappy Catholic Protestant groups. That sectarian element, when fueled with the cultural and national diversity there, or the limited diversity, we can see large implications. So I'm KOINE.org. We just simply wish to, no pun intended, sometimes peel back all the complex abstract things and demonstrate. And today we have a lot of banter over eschatology, pre, mid, or post. And those are already just charged, and people pick one, and they're seldom told that resurrection, the action to raise someone up and to seize someone away, rapture, that's a verb, that those occur simultaneously. They're never told about the adverb simultaneously. The preposition together with is there, which should function well to show that relationship. But then, for example, people don't distinguish as the KOINE highly inflected, very particular language, which makes a big deal about definite articles, adjectives, modifiers like that. Tribulation and tribulation the Great. It's like someone named Alexander and then Alexander the Great. We would know from historical knowledge, those that would have just a small amount of knowledge know there's such a person as Alexander the Great. Well, the tribulation the Great is very unique as well, but seldom distinguished by people who don't find themselves prompted and scripted by the language. Even the English Bibles, the historical holistic hermeneutic process would be very advantageous if someone used it to study, for example, the great English Bible that has come to us because of William Tyndale, the Baptist translator. And you could really glean much and probably not find near the dependency upon the biblical Hebrew and Koine Greek New Testament if you just took a good English text and followed the science of hermeneutics in that historical holistic process. So that's enough. IamKoine.org. That one's this one's glaringly apparent, but unless you think that way, it doesn't usually happen that way. So you have a blessed day.